of Sustainability for Lendlease Australia. I have worked in there for most of my life at Lendlease, which is an interesting thing for some people who can't even imagine working in an organisation for more than a few years. So I've worked at Lendlease for 30 years. I'm an architect originally by training, and I came in through a graduate program. On site was my first job as a site engineer, and I've had a very eclectic career. The last 10 years, maybe 15, have been in the space of sustainability, either at a corporate level looking at our metrics or at various business unit levels. My role now is to lead a team of around 50 people who are supporting both projects and businesses across all Lendlease business lines. So we've got about 6 different businesses within the Australia business that go from construction related to investment management, to development, to retirement living, communities, etc. And our team support all of those businesses in progressing our environmental and social outcomes, and particularly targeting our Mission Zero ambition to be absolute zero carbon by 2040.
Fantastic. And how have you seen the overall progression in the sustainability space over time, and leading to where we are today, and how the focus on materials has sort of been adjusted over time as well?
It's been a very, in hindsight, a very quick, albeit probably still needs to be faster, change. When I first started in some of my sustainability roles, a lot of what I was doing was trying to persuade people why they needed to think about sustainability and trying to earn the right to embed it within the business and within our thinking. That has totally shifted now to how. So we're not having those discussions anymore about should we be doing this. It's about how do we do it and how fast and how far can we go. So quite a radical shift. Customer requests have exponentially increased in the last few years, to be honest. I mean, so we had pockets of excellence where there were particular customers who were asking us for sophisticated sustainability outcomes, but we're now getting a very consistent ask, particularly from the government clients, around sustainability, both social and environmental. And in that environment space, we're just seeing the shift to a focus around embodied carbon, and that scope upfront, scope 3 emissions around materials starting to come in more routinely into the requests that we're receiving. But we're all learning that we need to really increase the attention on those scope 3 emissions, because they are such a large proportion of the impact that we have on the planet.
100%. And for those who are new to this space, what is the scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and what is the definition of embodied carbon? What does that include?
So it varies depending on who you are. So I'm going to put on the hat of a builder, developer, asset owner. So for us, the scope 1 emissions, these are the emissions that you have direct control over, that you can choose. And for us, those are the fuels that we burn. So they're gas used to heat our water or to air condition our buildings. It's fuels that we burn on site, so in diesel in cranes or in construction, diggers and bulldozers and the like. So that's sort of within our realm, and we can choose what we use there. Scope 2 is the power we consume, the electricity that we buy. So again, we have a level of control over that. It's a little bit indirect because we don't produce the power ourselves, so we don't make a call around that, but we can choose the type of power we buy and where we buy it from and how much we use by how efficient we are. So those 2 areas, scope 1 and 2, you'll find that they're the focus of most people's carbon targets. So when you look at an organisation and if they've given themselves carbon targets, they're usually talking about scope 1 and 2. For us, however, we can't leave scope 3 out of that equation. And the scope 3 emissions are the emissions that we don't control, but we influence and we create because we've either facilitated the action to happen or we've purchased a product or a service. So in the case of being a builder, we've purchased concrete, steel, glass, aluminium, facades, timber, etc. So we're buying materials, we're buying product. We don't manufacture those materials and products, but the entity that does manufacture them creates an enormous amount of carbon emissions in that process. and they also create emissions as they transport them to our site. So we have a role to play in those materials coming to us. So that's our scope 3 upfront. Then downstream, after we've handed the building over to somebody, they're turning on the lights, they're turning on the air conditioning, they're living and breathing in that building, and they're creating emissions in that process. And they're our downstream scope 3 emissions. So when you talk about embodied carbon, we're talking about those upfront emissions, the carbon that's embodied or captured in the manufacturing of the building materials for us. And that accounts, just that little, our scope 3, nearly every year, it's more than 90% of our overall emissions profile.
Yeah,
so you put them all together and it's huge, it's like massive.
Yeah, that is absolutely huge. And have you, I mean, is the targets for Lendlease over time, is that incorporating that? What is the target going forward at the moment?
So we have two targets. As part of being a 1.5 degree aligned company, we've got two targets. The first one is to be net zero for scopes 1 and 2 in 2025. So we're doing everything we can at the moment to be as efficient with the fuels we burn and the electricity we use, so that we can then have a very small amount that we offset as the residual. But come 2040, we want to be absolute zero, no safety net of offsets in everything, scope 1, 2 and 3. So that means that up front, we need to work alongside our supply chain to alter the way materials are manufactured and to choose different materials and to build differently and design differently. And downstream, we need to work with our tenants to make sure that they're using renewable electricity themselves.
So working with the material supply chain, how can, what's the pathway for working with them, and how can supply chains improve their ways? And is there any sort of commonalities amongst all the materials on this one?
Yeah, so this is what you might have heard of the term of a wicked problem. This is a wicked problem. It's a very complex web to unpack how to actually shift materials manufacture to be low embodied carbon. We did some research as an organisation a couple of years ago. We went and interviewed our supply chain, and we partnered with WWF, who were doing some similar sort of research. And what was really evident was how systemic the mess that we've got ourselves into is. So there's this sort of little wheel of misfortune, I'd call it, that we're stuck in, that goes something like this. It goes, we have infrequent requests for low or no embodied carbon materials. Therefore, as a result, it's rare that a supplier gets asked to produce anything differently or to manufacture differently. So it's difficult for a supplier to then justify changing the way they manufacture to be low or no embodied carbon in its outcome, because they just can't make that investment because they haven't got enough people buying that product from them. Therefore, there's less low embodied or no embodied carbon options in the marketplace, so they're less tried and tested, and therefore the clients are less likely to want to ask for them because there's less available and it seems more risky. And we just go round and round in this circle. So we realised pretty quickly that we can't solve this as Lendlease, that this is something that we need to hold hands on. So with competitors, with peers, with designers, all of us, which is where the formation of MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, comes into play, where we've got all the players in the industry, the customers who are requesting things in their tenders and bids, the people who are managing the assets at the end of the life, the designers, the architects, the supply chain, the head contractors, all together trying to work on how to resolve this issue. We've got half a chance if we hold hands.
Yeah, and it's one hell of a wicked problem, and I understand MECLA's broken it up into different categories. So what are the big ticket items that are getting looked at currently and worked out between competitors who traditionally might be, competing against each other, but everyone holding hands in this case to solve common problems?
Yeah, it's very, it's a dance. We have to dance very carefully to make sure that we're not breaching, the competition laws, etc. But there's huge will. I mean, we've got hundreds of organisations who signed up to MECLA in a very short period of time. We're focusing in a number of different spaces. So we've got a group that I'm chairing that's looking at trying to drive demand. So we're working with policymakers, particularly in state level governments, to encourage those governments to actually embed embodied carbon related policy within their tender processes or within their development applications or their building codes, etc., so that there is a consistency to the ask. So we're looking at ways to make sure that that embodied carbon features all the time, every time in every project request. So that's one of the groups. There's another group that's looking at the nightmare that is the benchmarking tools that exist. It's actually not easy to identify is something low embodied carbon, because there are a multitude of different ways of measuring and assessing how you define that, and it's really very complicated, and depending on which tool you use, some products, you know, come up trumps over others, and so there's lots of vested interest in which tool to use. It's quite a difficult area to navigate. So that working group has the unenviable task of listing all the tools that are available, what they're good for, what they're not good for, you know, what their limitations are, so that organisations can make a choice as to which ones they're going to run with and use. We've got a knowledge sharing work group that's been running some fantastic, what they call spotlight sessions, where we've been doing, you know, free education basically around how materials are manufactured and low embodied carbon options for each of them. We've had one on concrete, some on steel, some on aluminium, etc. We've got a group that's looking at specifications. What's the best way to specify materials or designs so that you have a reduced embodied carbon outcome? It sounds obvious, but it's not. Sometimes you can accidentally cut off certain options just by the way you specify. So trying to help the government clients and non-government clients with knowing how to specify so that they actually achieve what they would hope to. And then we've got a series of working groups that are just focused on particular materials. So there's a concrete working group, a steel working group, aluminium, etc. We've just recently added a building services working group. And so those people are coming together and sharing what's, you know, possible for them to share, but also organising some of those information sessions to help us understand more some of the ins and outs of what it means to reduce the embodied carbon of their manufacturing processes.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot being worked through, and it's been a great initiative. And you know, the one you're chairing, it's super interesting. So do you see, I mean, there's obviously big developers with net zero carbon targets and absolute zero carbon targets. Do you see this broadening? And obviously the biggest broadening would be a step up in the building code. Do you envision a future where that is the case? And
absolutely,
it is mandatory.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have said that a year ago. So a year ago, we were wondering how to get government attention around this. We were brainstorming, you know, who do we need to be influencing and how might we go about that? And we were imagining that it would be hard to open the door. I'm now actually getting invitations from New South Wales government in particular to come and talk to, you know, a whole bunch of their agencies about policy ideas that we have, because they are very passionate about trying to reduce embodied carbon footprint of their work, and they're not quite sure, you know, what are the best mechanisms to use. So hopefully we'll start to see that broadening out to be across all the states, and we've had plenty of interest from the other states as well. So I don't think it's that far away. The Neighbours tool, which some people may be familiar with, which in the past has just dealt with energy and water, is in the process over the next 18 months of landing a methodology for measuring embodied carbon that will then be disclosed in much the same way as energy levels are currently disclosed around that Neighbours tool for office tenancies, etc. So if people think they can sit under a bush and and hide from this, I think they might have a rude awakening. It's coming at lightning pace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to ask you about the short, medium, and long term. But I mean, if someone is hiding behind a bush, the short term, without, you know, cleaning directly up the supply chain, is maybe offsets as a transition, you know, transitionary tool. So, what is the use of offsets? And feel free to challenge on what I said.
Well, no, yeah, I was going to say, I think I'd put offsets possibly not so much in the short. To the short term, I'll come to offsets because it's a really interesting area, so don't let me forget. But short term, there's a whole lot of stuff out in the marketplace right now with a reduced embodied carbon footprint. So there are different ways of manufacturing cement immediately available to us. There's, cementitious replacement is alive and well, and for a large proportion of the structure, it's possible to, replace Portland cement with a whole bunch of fly ash, etc. This is available right here, right now. Something close to your heart, timber is available right here, right now. We know these things are how they work. We understand structurally where they are. We can buy them immediately. There's the roadblocks are more around will, skill, in some cases, but not all, price premium. There's not always a price premium, because in some instances, a timber structure, for example, may be less costly if the weight of your building is an issue, and because they're a much lighter frame, or if the speed is an issue and you need to get something to market more quickly and lettable. So there's a whole series of things that we should be looking at immediately. So the short term, I think, is use what's there. Go out and make use of what's there. There's low embodied carbon versions of aluminium and steel right here, right now. We should be using them. The offset piece, interestingly, one of the policies that we've been putting together for MECLA, we have explicitly been saying to people, offsets, as let's say a manufacturer has a carbon neutral product that they're offering by using offsets. So they've done their very best to reduce their emissions, and then they are going out into the market and purchasing offsets for the rest. That is absolutely better than them not doing that at all, because offsets, if they're purchased well and they have strong governance behind them, do genuinely make an impact on climate change right here, right now. However, they are not the long-term solution. They are an interim step, and we've got to be careful that they're not a distraction from stopping us ultimately transforming the way we manufacture materials so that there's no emissions in the first place. And the thing that we need to be mindful is that some people don't understand the difference between a carbon neutral product and a low embodied carbon product. So you could have a very high embodied carbon footprint and just be prepared to be spending a lot of money on offsets and call yourselves carbon neutral. But ultimately, what that manufacturer is best investing their energies in is how to reduce the embodied carbon. So it's sort of like a offset, but don't use that. Don't rest on those laurels. That's not the end game. That's not the journey. And that's why at Lendlease, we're so committed to absolute zero. We're not 100% sure how we're going to get there, particularly with materials, but we know that's where we've got to aim, and that if we don't set that aim to be absolute zero, we might stop short, and we can't afford to, as a human species, stop short. So we need to kind of keep progressing towards that absolute zero mark.
We were both at a conference last week, and there was a lot of talk and, feeling the heartbeat of just what the conference was, the general vibe of it all, and it was around building circularity. What do you see in that sense? It's something I get asked a lot in the timber industry, and it's, there is an element of speculation involved about having like the reuse market there. What do you see in the future in that area? And is there a spot for an ambitious entrepreneur to just create that whole reuse market or something like that?
Oh, completely. They're inextricably linked. So I don't think we're going to get to our absolute zero targets, particularly around scope 3, without there being some sort of circularity transformation of the market. And we also just simply don't have enough resources to continue to be using virgin resources. So they're totally connected. Circularity is a bit broader than just looking at embodied carbon. So it will look at that whole resource depletion and that closing the loop, and there being no such thing as waste anymore. So it's a bigger area, but it's kind of a cool thing to think of, that you can unpack something and recreate it back and use it again and again. And you can see organisations now starting to tinker in how to do that and where to do that. But again, it's one of those wicked problems around right from the beginning, we have a system that's set up on a linear idea that there's infinite resources that we can extract, and we haven't ever really thought about how you close the loop. We're not like nature. Nature's really, really good at that, and there's nothing in the natural cycle that ends up as superfluous, but we like superfluous, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to shift there. It's kind of coming next. I consider that the coming, at the moment, quite rightly, there's that strong focus on carbon, but very quickly people are starting to go, well, that means we also need to think about circularity, and it means we also need to think about nature and biodiversity. They're all coming, like everything, it's all connected.
All interconnected. Yeah, I feel like design for disassembly is, critical to at least leave the door open for the end of life. And at the conference, the first time I heard it, I forget the term, you might remember it, as like rather than extracting raw materials as your traditional supply chain, your new supply chain is the building owner or something along those lines. So that's the new.
Yeah. And they were also talking about mining landfill. And going in and actually, mining your landfill.
That's
to
a great
try and
idea.
extract the minerals and things that are sitting there quietly rotting and off-gassing.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in there. So it's been wonderful to get to speak to you today, Anne. Just an open-ended question for you, Anne. What is exciting you about the future going forward? I mean, we've been speaking a lot today about things you're obviously passionate about. What excites you the most going forward?
The pace of change. I'm still impatient for it to be faster, but the attention the sustainability agenda is now getting everywhere, be it, at my children's schools, or be it in the work that I do, or, even in your local gym that you attend. It's far more prevalent. I'm excited by the number of independent political candidates that are standing for the federal election on the back of climate action. And I'm really hopeful that even if they don't get in, that will show a very clear signal to our political parties that the communities are really passionate about being genuine around climate action. So I think that's been a really positive shift, that there's so much attention there. So just, that movement and a lot of noise in that space. And I know it sounds cliche, but I genuinely am excited about our Mission Zero. I am so proud that we have set ourselves that benchmark without necessarily, knowing all of the answers, but we got a really strong roadmap. We know the steps that we're taking, and I'm really just looking forward to taking our organisation on that journey, but also sharing that and hoping that others are coming on that journey too, because we can't, it's no point one company doing this. We've all got to get on board. Yeah,
absolutely. And Lendlease has been critical already in that space, and unlocking a lot of the mass timber market with those bold 5 or 6 projects around Australia, which were huge step changes and probably made everyone else have the confidence to make the steps themselves. So,
they're stunning. They're stunning spaces to be in, and they're still, our fastest tenanted spaces ever are all those beautiful timber buildings. So there'll be more of that. We absolutely need more of that.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to speak to you. And if people want to find out more about this topic, or is there anywhere in general people should go to if they want to learn more about what we've been speaking about today?
Sure. So the Mission Zero journey that Lendlease is on is in lendlease.com. It's the opening page. So there's a whole journey there. You can see our roadmaps and all of our targets mapped out. If you're interested in learning more about MECLA now also has its own web presence. So you can go, I think it's mecla.org. We might have to just check that and make sure we give the right address, but it's just a recently launched website. So we've been previously working through the WWF website, but it's got its own standalone one now. Dr. Google has a huge amount out there on embodied carbon, but some of it can be very confusing. So it might be a good place to start with MECLA.
Yeah, that's so
The
good.
supply chain school, actually, the sustainable supply chain school, if there's suppliers out there who are wondering, you know, whether they're doing enough in this space or haven't had much exposure to it, the sustainable supply chain school has a whole series of materials available to help people understand all the different types of embodied carbon.